When I saw my husband standing beside my father's coffin wearing the dress I wore just last week, something inside me cracked. The cathedral was silent, except for the slow, steady drip of rain from the stained glass windows and the low hum of whispered prayers. The heavy scent of lilies and old wood pressed against my chest, making it hard to breathe. I was supposed to be mourning my father, Arthur Bennett, but there, right in the front row, standing too close to the polished casket, was Daniel, my husband, flanked by a woman who looked like she'd stolen the spotlight. And more than that, my identity. Sienna, the mistress, her laugh, soft and shameless, cut through the quiet like a knife. And the dress she wore, the silk, the cut, the very designer label embroidered inside was mine. It was the one I had worn to our anniversary dinner, the one Daniel always told me he loved on me. Now, here she was, parading it as if it was her own badge of conquest. I felt frozen, my heartbeat thudding painfully in my ears, drowning out the organ's low notes. I had no idea what to do with the surge of shock, betrayal, and raw humiliation. All I could think was, how did my father's funeral become a stage for their affair? My father was everything to me. Arthur Bennett was a man of quiet strength, a pillar in our small town, and a man whose word was law in our family. For years, I had watched him build a legacy of hard work and generosity, and I thought I knew everything about my life, my family, my marriage, my future. But that day, sitting in St. Michael's Cathedral, I realized how much I had been blind. Before the funeral, my world was a carefully stitched quilt of routines and small joys. Morning started with the smell of fresh coffee and the warm, comforting clatter of breakfast dishes. Daniel would always kiss my cheek before rushing off to his law practice, his briefcase in one hand and a phone glued to the other. We had our flaws like any couple, but beneath it all, I believed we were partners. I thought his love was real because it felt easy, familiar. My father's presence loomed large in everything. His voice was a low rumble, full of stories and lessons from a life that had never been easy. "Always be prepared, Clara," he used to say. "But never lose yourself." I never imagined his last lesson would come wrapped in heartbreak and betrayal. In the weeks leading to the funeral, something shifted. Daniel started coming home late. At first, I thought it was the stress of planning and work. But little things began to gnaw at me, a faint perfume on his collar, the way he'd snap when I asked a simple question, the way his eyes flickered away when I caught him looking at his phone. I told myself I was imagining things. I told myself I was being paranoid. But a woman's intuition doesn't lie. One evening, I caught a glimpse of Sienna's name flashing across his screen just before he silenced it. That same night, Daniel's behavior changed. He was distant, distracted, and I felt like a stranger in my own home. Then, the day of the funeral came. I was ready to say goodbye to my father, to honor his memory and find comfort in the family I thought I had. Instead, I walked into a nightmare. Sienna was there, sitting beside Daniel, their hands brushing, their smiles too familiar. My breath caught in my throat as I realized that dress, the one I had agonized over for weeks, was on her. I saw the faces of family friends stiffen. Whispered questions passed through the pews like wildfire. The air turned heavy, electric with unsaid truths. But I held my ground. I knew then that this moment would change everything. When it was my turn to speak at the podium, the cathedral held its breath. I looked out at the sea of familiar faces, friends, relatives, neighbors, and I told the truth. I told them about Daniel's betrayal. I told them about the secret life he had been leading right under my nose. And then, with a steady voice, I revealed my father's last will, a document no one knew about until that moment. Arthur Bennett had left his entire fortune to me, in a trust protected by layers of legal safeguards that Daniel could never touch. To Daniel, my father had left a symbolic sum, a cold reminder that he was cut off, his privilege stripped away. To Sienna, even less a stark message that her place was not among us. The cathedral echoed with stunned silence, then murmurs and gasps. I felt a strange calm wash over me. For years, I had allowed Daniel's shadow to dim my own light. Now, with my father's legacy behind me, I knew I was free. But freedom doesn't come without pain. In the days that followed, the scandal erupted. Friends took sides. Rumors spread faster than wildfire. My life was no longer private. Yet, I found solace in the one secret my father left me, a small beach cottage, hidden away from the world, where I could heal and rebuild. There, with the ocean breeze and the crashing waves as my companions, I began to learn the true meaning of strength. Arthur's last gift wasn't the money. It was the proof of his love, and the tools to navigate betrayal. So he emerged stronger. The first morning in that beach cottage felt like stepping into another world. The salty tang of the ocean air mixed with the faint scent of pine from the nearby woods. I stood barefoot on the worn wooden porch, the rough grains pressing against my skin as the first light of dawn painted the sky in soft pinks and oranges. The steady rhythm of the waves crashing against the shore was a quiet heartbeat, steady and reassuring. For the first time in weeks, I felt something I hadn't dared to before. Peace. The cottage was small, but cozy, filled with simple furnishings and family photos my father must have left behind. It wasn't the mansion Daniel had always bragged about, or the luxurious lifestyle his law practice supposedly supported. It was real. It was honest. And it was mine. Before all this happened, my days had been a blur of obligations and routines. Daniel and I lived in a large home nestled on the edge of town, one that I had helped pay for through my family's business. I worked as a coordinator at a local nonprofit, a job I loved because it gave me purpose beyond the walls of our home and the shadows of my father's expectations. Our life looked perfect to the outside world. Daniel was well-respected, handsome in a clean-cut way, and charming when he wanted to be. He was known as the Golden Boy, the one who married into the Bennett family fortune and climbed the social ladder effortlessly. But behind closed doors, things were different. Our conversations had become clipped, the warmth between us replaced by tension. I remember one night, after dinner, the way his fingers barely touched mine as he excused himself to the study. The scent of his cologne lingered long after he left the room. But there was something else. Something that made my skin crawl, a faint perfume I couldn't place. It wasn't the Daniel I married. The first clue, the whisper of doubt, came not from Daniel, but from a misplaced detail. A text message I accidentally glimpsed on his laptop while he was in the shower. A message from Sienna with a heart emoji and plans to meet later that week. I froze. My breath caught. But then I pushed it aside. Maybe it was nothing, I told myself. Maybe just a friend. But the feeling lingered like a bruise. Days later, I found myself standing outside a cafe across town, staring through the rain-speckled window at Daniel and a woman whose laughter rang too freely, her hand resting casually on his knee. That was Sienna. She wasn't a shadow or a whisper anymore. She was real, and she was in my life. I didn't confront Daniel right away. Part of me was scared. Scared of what I might discover. Scared of losing everything I thought I had. But the truth has a way of coming out. One evening, as I was clearing the table, I overheard Daniel's voice on the phone. His tone was low, urgent, but laced with irritation. I don't care about the Bennett money anymore. She'll never know what I'm really worth. Just keep things quiet. The words hit me like a punch. He had been living off my family's fortune all this time. Our lifestyle, the trips, the house, it was all built on my father's wealth. And the worst part? He thought it was his right. That night, I sat in the dark, the ticking clock on the wall a constant reminder that time was slipping away from me. I thought about my father, a man who had always been honest, even when the truth was hard, and I realized that I owed him one last thing. I had to protect what he had built. The funeral was a storm in itself. As I walked into St. Michael's Cathedral, the smell of incense and polished wood filled my senses, mixing with the heavy weight of grief. But what hit me most wasn't the sorrow. It was the sight of Daniel and Sienna, their closeness, the way they whispered behind their hands, completely unashamed. I felt my cheeks burn, my hands clench. When I stepped to the podium for the eulogy, I fought the urge to break down. Instead, I steadied my voice and told the story of my father, a man who valued loyalty and truth above all. And then, with deliberate calm, I exposed Daniel's betrayal. I revealed the secret was my father's final act of protection, the trust that shielded me from Daniel's grasp. The symbolic sums left to Daniel and Sienna, silent judgments carved into the pages of my father's legacy. The room was stunned, eyes wide, whispers growing louder, but I felt nothing but clarity. For the first time, I was in control. After the funeral, the scandal exploded. Friends and neighbors whispered behind closed doors. Daniel's reputation crumbled. Sienna vanished like a ghost. And I finally felt the weight lift from my shoulders. In the quiet of the beach cottage, I began to rebuild, slowly. Day by day, I learned that true strength wasn't about wealth or appearances. It was about knowing your worth, standing up to betrayal, and finding peace within yourself. The days following the funeral were a strange blend of chaos and calm. The scandal spread like wildfire. Phone calls I didn't answer, messages piling up, friends and acquaintances calling with hesitant voices. Some offered sympathy, others judgment. But through it all, I clung to the quiet sanctuary of the beach cottage. The walls here didn't whisper secrets. The ocean didn't carry gossip. The breeze didn't judge. I spent mornings walking the shore, sand slipping between my toes, waves brushing my ankles like gentle reminders that life moves forward with or without our permission. But the truth is, the storm inside me hadn't settled. I kept replaying the moment in the cathedral, how I stood there, voice steady, while revealing the truth about Daniel and Sienna. How I held my father's last will in my trembling hands, knowing that the money and power I inherited weren't just numbers on a page, they were my shield, my freedom. Daniel had always relied on my family's fortune. His law firm, the cars, the trips, none of it was his own. My father saw through it all, and his will was the final statement of that truth. It wasn't just about money. It was about respect. I realized then that Daniel never truly respected me. Not as a partner, not as a person. He saw me as a vessel for wealth and status. Sienna was his trophy, the careless mistress wearing my stolen dress as a badge of victory. But I refused to be a victim in this story. I contacted a divorce attorney the next week. It was a difficult decision, the end of a marriage, the unraveling of years but necessary. The lawyer was kind but firm, and as we talked, I felt a strange surge of power. This wasn't just about ending a marriage. It was reclaiming my life. Daniel's attempts to contest the will were swift but futile. The trust was airtight, protected by layers of legal safeguards my father had painstakingly built. And as the legal battles unfolded, I turned to other parts of my life. I reconnected with old friends who had stood by me quietly through the years. I threw myself into work at the nonprofit, finding purpose in helping others rather than drowning in my own pain. Slowly, the pieces of my life began to come together, not perfectly, but honestly. One afternoon, while sorting through my father's belongings in the cottage, I found a small leather-bound journal. Its pages were filled with my father's handwriting, thoughts, memories, advice. One passage caught my eye. "Clara, life will test you. It will demand you to choose between bitterness and grace. Choose grace. Let love guide your steps, even when others fail you. Remember, your worth is not in what others give, but in what you carry inside." Tears blurred my vision as I read those words. It felt like my father was speaking directly to me, reminding me that his love was stronger than any betrayal. The town slowly began to accept the new reality. The whispers about Daniel and Sienna faded, replaced by stories of my strength and resilience. I wasn't the woman broken by betrayal. I was the woman who had risen from it. I spent weekends at the beach cottage, the ocean wind tangling my hair, the sun warming my skin. I painted, I wrote, I dreamed again. The small place became a sanctuary, a symbol of my rebirth. Of course, healing wasn't linear. Some nights, I'd wake up with a racing heart, haunted by memories, but I learned to breathe through the pain, to forgive myself for the things I couldn't control. Because forgiveness wasn't about them, it was about freeing myself. Daniel tried reaching out a few times, through emails and phone calls, but I never responded. His wealth stripped away, his reputation tarnished. I imagined him facing the cold truth of his own making. I didn't hate him. I pitied the man who could never see the value of what he had until it was gone. This journey taught me the most important lesson of all. True legacy isn't about money or possessions. It's about love, the love we give ourselves, the courage to stand alone, and the strength to rebuild. The phone call came just as the sun was dipping below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery oranges and purples. It was from Daniel's lawyer, and I already knew what it was about the final attempt to negotiate, to plead for a settlement that would salvage whatever scraps he could from my father's legacy. I listened quietly as the lawyer outlined Daniel's demands, veiled threats, and desperate promises. But I had already made my choice. The wounds were too deep, the trust shattered beyond repair. I told him simply, no. That night, as I stood on the porch of the beach cottage, the salt air cool against my skin, I thought about the years Daniel and I had shared. It wasn't all darkness. There had been moments, brief flashes of laughter, shared dreams whispered in the quiet of night, the way his hand felt in mine when everything was calm. But those moments had been just that, flashes, not the steady light I needed. The public fallout from the funeral scandal rippled through our town for weeks. Friends I thought were close kept their distance, unsure where to place their loyalty. Business partners of my father looked at me with a mixture of sympathy and caution, but there were also unexpected pillars of support. Neighbors who brought over meals, old friends who sent letters of encouragement, even strangers who reached out online after hearing my story. It reminded me that even when the people closest to us fail, there is always a community willing to catch us. I took control of the family trust, hiring a financial advisor who understood the importance of preserving my father's vision. The money was no longer a symbol of status. It became a tool for good, supporting causes my father cared about, funding scholarships, helping local businesses thrive. In doing so, I found purpose beyond my own pain. One afternoon, I received an invitation to a charity gala hosted by the nonprofit I worked with. Daniel was not invited, of course, but Sienna was there, an unexpected sight that stirred old emotions. She approached me with a tentative smile, eyes downcast. "I never wanted to hurt you," she whispered. "I was foolish and selfish." I looked at her not with anger, but with a quiet sadness. "Everyone makes mistakes," I said softly. "But it's what we do after that defines us." She nodded, and I realized that forgiveness wasn't about forgetting it, was about releasing the power pain had over me. The cottage became my haven, but I also re-engaged with the town I once took for granted. I started small, attending local meetings, volunteering, reconnecting with my roots. One morning, while walking along the shore, I bumped into an old friend from childhood, someone who knew me before the Bennett name carried weight. She looked at me with genuine warmth and said, "You're stronger than you think, Clara." In that moment, I realized I was no longer just my father's daughter or Daniel's wife. I was myself, whole, resilient, and ready to live on my own terms. Rebuilding wasn't easy. There were days when loneliness crept in, and nights when doubts whispered in the darkness. But I learned to sit with those feelings, to acknowledge them without letting them define me. I started journaling, writing letters to myself, a practice my father once encouraged, reminding me that my worth was never tied to anyone else's approval. Eventually, I moved out of the old family home. The house was sold, and the proceeds added to the trust. I found a small apartment in town, modest, warm, filled with sunlight. It was mine. I didn't rush into new relationships. I needed time to rediscover who I was beyond the roles imposed on me. Instead, I focused on growing, healing, and living authentically. One day, a letter arrived from Daniel. He wrote about regret, about the life he'd lost, about the mistakes he made. I read it quietly, then set it aside. I didn't reply. Closure didn't come from him. It came from within. My father's legacy was not just the money or the trust. It was the lesson that even in betrayal, love endures the love we carry for ourselves, the strength we find in adversity, and the grace with which we rise. The months that followed the divorce were a slow unfolding of new beginnings and unexpected discoveries. I found myself learning to live again in ways I hadn't thought possible. For the first time in years, I wasn't defined by my marriage or my family name. I was simply Clara. There was a freedom in that, but it came with its own challenges. One of the hardest parts was rebuilding trust, not just in others, but in myself. I had spent so long doubting my instincts, excusing Daniel's lies, hoping things would get better. Now, I learned to listen to the quiet voice inside that said, "You deserve more." I began therapy, not because I was broken, but because I wanted to understand myself better. The sessions were a mix of tears and revelations, of grief and healing. They taught me that betrayal doesn't define us unless we let it. I also took to exploring new passions. I started painting, something I hadn't done since I was a teenager. My small apartment filled with canvases of stormy seas and bright skies, reflections of my inner turmoil and hope. I volunteered more at the nonprofit, taking on leadership roles that allowed me to make a difference. The trust my father left was no longer a chain. It was a tool to build something meaningful. Occasionally, I'd think about Daniel and Sienna, wondering how their lives had changed. From what I heard, Daniel's practice suffered, his reputation tarnished beyond repair. Sienna disappeared from town, leaving behind whispers and rumors. But I didn't feel anger anymore. I felt compassion for two people trapped by their own choices. One evening, as I watched the sunset from my porch, I found myself reflecting on everything I had lost and gained. Losing my father was the hardest pain I'd ever known. Losing Daniel was a betrayal that cut deep. But in those losses, I found the courage to reclaim my story. My father's last will had been more than a legal document. It was a symbol, a final act of love and protection. It told me I was worth fighting for, that I could rise. Even when the ground beneath me crumbled, I wasn't just surviving, I was living. And for the first time, on my own terms. The day the news broke, I was sitting in my small kitchen, the kettle whistling softly in the background. I just poured myself a cup of tea when my phone buzzed, messages flooding in from friends, family, even strangers. The story had gone viral. The scandal at my father's funeral, the revelation of Daniel's betrayal, and the unveiling of the will. For a moment, I felt exposed, as if every secret I'd tried to bury was now on display for the world to see. But that feeling was fleeting, because now, the truth was out. The public reaction was a mixture of shock, sympathy, and, to be honest, some judgment. In a town like ours, news travels fast. Some people whispered behind closed doors, others spoke openly, but almost everyone knew the story. Daniel was the one everyone remembered as the charming husband, the golden boy married into wealth. But now, that image was shattered. I heard about how his law firm was reeling from the fallout. Clients were leaving. Partners were distancing themselves. His lifestyle, which I'd long suspected was sustained by my father's fortune, was crumbling like a house of cards. Sienna's name was dragged through the mud as well. No longer the carefree mistress, but a symbol of deceit and betrayal. Despite the whispers and the sideways glances, I held my head high. I wasn't ashamed. I had stood up in that cathedral, in front of the people I'd known my whole life, and spoken my truth. That courage wasn't just for me. It was for anyone who had ever been silenced by betrayal. There were some unexpected consequences. The local newspaper ran a feature story about me, the woman who reclaimed her life and her family's legacy. Letters poured in from women who had faced similar pain, from men who wanted to understand, from neighbors who offered support. It reminded me that even in brokenness, there is connection. I used the trust my father had left wisely. Funds were allocated to community projects, scholarships for young women, and programs supporting victims of domestic betrayal and abuse. It was my way of turning pain into purpose. Daniel's attempts to salvage his reputation failed. He became a cautionary tale, a man undone by greed and betrayal. But I never gloated. Justice, I realized, is not cruelty disguised as revenge. It's accountability wrapped in dignity. The experience reshaped my view of wealth and legacy. Money is fleeting. Trust, love, and integrity, those are the true treasures. And those are the gifts my father truly wanted me to have. Rebuilding my life after the storm wasn't easy, but it was necessary. The beach cottage became my refuge, a place where I could breathe, reflect, and slowly piece together who I was beyond the titles and betrayals. Each morning, I'd wake to the sound of waves, the smell of salt in the air, and the quiet promise of a new day. It was in those moments of solitude that healing began. I started small cooking meals for myself, tending to the garden my father once loved, taking long walks along the shore. Simple acts, but they grounded me. They reminded me that life goes on, even when it feels broken. Friends who had stayed quietly in the background stepped forward. Their presence was a balm, a reminder that I wasn't alone. We shared laughter and tears, memories of my father, and hopes for the future. Work became a sanctuary. At the nonprofit, I found purpose in helping others who had been betrayed, abandoned, or silenced. The stories echoed my own, and in helping them heal, I healed too. One afternoon, while painting in my small studio, I paused to look at the canvas before me. It was a stormy sea, waves crashing against rocks. But beyond the storm, the sky was breaking open with light. That image captured everything. I was feeling the turbulence of betrayal, the strength to endure, and the hope of a new beginning. I realized then that my father's true legacy wasn't the money. It was the lessons he taught me about resilience, love, and grace. Sometimes, I still think about Daniel, not with anger, but with a quiet sadness. He was a man who lost his way, blinded by greed and selfishness, and I was lucky enough to find mine. My journey has taught me that betrayal can break us, or it can make us. It's a choice we all face. Would you have had the strength to stand up as I did? To protect your heart and your legacy? To find peace in the wreckage? I hope my story offers a little light to anyone walking through their own storm, because in the end, the greatest love we can hold is the one we give ourselves. I hope my story offers a little light to anyone walking through their own storm, because in the end, the greatest love we can hold is the one we give ourselves. Thank you for listening to my story. If there's one thing I've learned through all the heartbreak and healing, it's this. Life will test us in ways we never expect. People we trust may betray us, and the future we imagined can crumble in an instant. But within that pain lies a choice. We can let it consume us, or we can rise stronger, wiser, and more compassionate. My father's last gift to me wasn't just the money or the trust. It was the lesson that my worth isn't tied to anyone else's approval, and that true strength comes from loving and believing in ourselves, even when others fail. So, I ask you, dear listener, have you ever faced betrayal that shook your world? How did you find the courage to move forward? Or, if you haven't yet faced that storm, how would you want to protect your heart? Life doesn't come with a manual, but stories like these remind us we're not alone. If my story resonated with you, please consider subscribing and sharing your thoughts below. Your voice matters, and together, we can create a space where truth, healing, and strength flourish. Remember, no matter what you're going through, there is light waiting for you on the other side. Thank you for being here.